I think what we've got to go to is not get too ideological about it. In the end, rational policy is always good.
Well, let's stick with ideology for a moment, because this is a central thesis of Kevin Rudd in his new monthly article. His idea is a financial crisis is an event of seismic significance and has killed off what he calls the great neoliberal experiment of the past 30 years. Do you think that's right?
Depends what you call neoliberal. I mean, you take Australia. When I became Treasurer, the effective rate of protection on cars was 96%. Today it's 6%. You can walk out and buy a Volkswagen Polo now for $16,000. It would have otherwise cost you 35 or 40. Wasn't that good? Of course it was good, you know.
So you identify with some of the so-called neoliberal ideas.
Yeah. I mean, we've got a floating exchange rate. The thing that saved us through the Asian crisis is we went down to 48 cents. When the terms of trade boom came to protect us from inflation, it went up to 96 cents, and now in less well times, it's now down to 64 or 65. In other words, it's completely flexible. The same in the wages system. I took Australia out of centralised wage fixing into enterprise bargaining, and we've had a flexible labour market returning about 4.5% for wages for the last 15 years.
Okay, well, this is my point, really, because
we're not opposed to any of that.
But Kevin Rudd is painting this as an ideological narrative. Is putting the Liberal Party firmly in the camp of the extreme capitalists, whose negligence created the current crisis. Do you think people are going to buy that narrative? I mean, you once said that Kevin Rudd doesn't have a narrative. He seems to have got one now with the financial crisis.
Don't be too hard on me, Tony. No, what I was trying to say then was that the Prime Minister needed to get together an overarching story that people could relate to, and I think he's done much of that in the time since. But he's correct, though, in focusing on the point that at the very core, at the very heart of the Western financial system, there was, on the part of the American regulatory authorities, no attempt to pull this in. Now, it won't change. The fundamental problem is that we need people in the surplus countries to save less and spend more, so they don't accumulate these massive exportable financial surpluses. And we need people in the deficit countries, like the United States, Britain, Australia, Spain, to save more and spend less. That's the only way these imbalances...
Except we're about to become a serious deficit country. We're about to have a very large deficit. How big a deficit can a country like Australia sustain? I mean, you know...
Our fiscal position is pretty good because for a whole host of reasons, mainly the great growth through the 90s and the early period of the 2000s just produced tons of revenue. The underlying level of outlays were pulled back in the Labor years to under 5% of GDP. You know, if your outlays are at 25% of GDP and revenues are 26 or 27, you're going to run a surplus of 2% of GDP. So I don't think that is the real issue. I mean,
it's a real political issue.
Yeah, but the Australian deficit, Tony, will be a sideshow to the world scene. A sideshow.
And how necessary will it be to have that deficit go on and on and on until there is some glimmer of light? And you don't see any glimmer of light.
Well, no, I see a glimmer of light, but it won't come with the Americans playing tricky poo at the expense of all the surplus countries any longer. They're all going to have to fess up, you know. They made a welter out of it. You know, they're happy for these countries to pump the United States full of dollars, but it's blown up. This has happened every time we've seen countries subject to a supply of long-term funding and investment. When we saw the petrodollars of the 70s recycled into Mexico and Brazil, those countries blew up. This time we've seen the Chinese, the Russians, the Middle East, the Japanese and the Germans recycle a ton of money into America, and it's blown up.
The reason I asked the deficit question is because in the past, large deficits proven to be a huge political problem for the ALP. I mean, John Howard and Peter Costello constantly harp on the fact that Labor had left them with a large debt. It's going to happen again, isn't it?
But I ran the first federal surpluses in the nation's history, Tony. I know this. Malcolm Turnbull out with a porky tonight, talking about Labor and surpluses. The first federal surplus ever was introduced by me as Treasurer, 3 in a row and up to 2% of GDP. But again, it's all the stuff about fiscal conservatives and fiscal something. What you've got to be is a fiscal pragmatist. That is, when public expenditure falls away, private expenditure falls away, and it needs to be augmented with public expenditure, you let the budget go into deficit. When you see a surfeit of private expenditure, you pull the budget back into surplus. All that Peter Costello and John Howard did was take away the props that we still had in place in 96 and 97 for what was the pullout of the recession from 1992. In other words, they were helping get people back to work and smooth the transition back to a strong private economy. But before it got back, they started pulling the money out on the basis of some religious point. Let me just put this to you. Let's say we had no debt, and technically we have none, government debt. What case is there?
Well, Howard Costello would say that's down to them.
No, it's not down to them. It was just down to the growth that came from the reforms of the Hawke and Keating years, and nothing else produced it. Of course, they were the lucky mugs who picked up the money and then spent most of it. But leave that to one side. If you are in a position...